What's up, everybody? Welcome to Political Frenemies. I'm Chris Newton. I'm an academic and a former Tory defence policy advisor. We'll introduce our guest in a minute, but before we do that, I suppose I have to say hello to my co-host, Lib Dem activist and former councillor, Mathew Hulbert. Hello, Mathew. How are you doing?
I'm very well, Chris. Well, I think we may have to update how I'm introduced, because I've since our last recording, I've semi-returned to something approaching the front line of politics, because we had our local party AGM. You'd have loved it, Chris. Our local Lib Dem party AGM here in Hinckley and Bosworth last Friday night, and I'm now Bosworth Lib Dems policy officer. So that's I know you're delighted. I know you're thrilled about that. So that's a little step towards. I'm still going to be doing all my commentating and all of that. Don't worry, folks, in case you're worried. But it's a little bit of a step back to the front line of local politics.
Well, congratulations, and I'm sure you'll relish that opportunity. And well, we know you've got lots of opinions and lots of policy ideas, and it is good for the party that you're back feeding those ideas in.
I think that's the nicest you've ever been to me, Chris. So thank you.
I'm always nice. Every single week I'm nice to you.
Let's get to our guest, shall we?
Yeah, our guest is another doctor. I'm an academic. I'm a PhD. We've got another PhD academic as well, and he is political scientist Dr George Aylett. Hello, George. Could you please introduce yourself and sort of what's your, what do you do in terms of academia, but also your political background as well, because you've got quite a bit of a political background too.
Absolutely, and thank you both for having me on. Should be a very interesting discussion. My name's George, he, they. I'm a political scientist and historian. I used to teach British politics, environmental politics, and in the School of Earth and Environment, School of Sociology and Social Policy, and School of Politics and International Studies, where I finished my PhD on partycraft and the Labour Party leadership of Jeremy Corbyn at the University of Leeds. Essentially, I created a party leadership model to analyse the effectiveness of opposition leaders using Jeremy Corbyn as a case study. Myself and my political journey, I was a former Labour parliamentary candidate under Ed Miliband. I was then a regional organiser on Jeremy Corbyn's leadership campaign and supported Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party. I left Labour in 2022, I believe, because of Keir Starmer's leadership, institutional transphobia, the treatment of the left and the abandoning of trade unions. And I'm currently, where I'm based in the country in 2029, whoever's best place to win between your party or the Green Party is who I'll be voting for. I'm currently a Your Party member, but whoever is best placed to win in the where I'm living is who I'll be voting for between those two parties. So it should be very interesting, and we'll wait and see what happens over the next few years to see what 2029 will look like.
Thanks for that. It's a very sort of interesting political journey. Just turning to your PhD, because I think that's interesting. I think because we're interested in the issues here at Political Frenemies, but we also talk about the doing of politics, the mechanics of politics as well. I just wonder if you could give us a flavour as to what makes an effective opposition leader, and perhaps maybe say one or two words about Farage and Badenoch as you see them.
Absolutely. I think that's really, really interesting question, because to quantify the effectiveness of opposition leaders, you need to sort of have metrics to measure off. And I think an important thing is the acquisition of leadership, ensuring that you have a strong mandate, how you manage your party, not just your members of parliament, but also the internal structures within your party. It's about leading the discussions on policy, not just within the party, but also around the country as well. And of course, electioneering, how a party does, how they sort of attract their voters via their messaging and how they appeal to their audience, so either within certain constituencies or on a national scale if they're looking to form a government. So it's very, very interesting because Nigel Farage, for example, seems to have a clear mandate over his party, despite not being elected, but he has solidified his position there. He is effective party management. His MPs seem to be afraid to challenge him, and he's obviously very influential within his own party at pursuing his own agenda and also taking that agenda to the country as well. So I think it'll be really interesting to see how the Green Party do this, with Zach Polanski getting an 85% mandate and already shifting the Green Party, at least their rhetoric, not necessarily their policy. It'll be interesting to see what happens over the next few years. And indeed, what happens to the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives, how they sort of see themselves in opposition. And indeed, in 2029, when this Labour government are probably booted out of power, it'll be interesting to see how they sort of rebuild and what image they want to bring to the country, because I do think there's going to be a big seismic change within British politics in 2029. I think 2024 is when we saw the two-party system become a seven-party system, essentially. It's always had like other parties here and there or two-party plus system, but it is really fractured right now. So seeing how these parties sort of appeal to the country and how they rebuild, I think will be really interesting to see. But I'd love to talk about this more, and it should be interesting discussion coming ahead.
And George, in terms of the Corbyn Sultana vehicle, currently known as your party, which you say you're a member, I mean, it's not been the most auspicious of starts, has it? And I mean, even this day that we're recording on the Friday, one of the MPs, kind of at least loosely aligned with it, one of the independent alliance of MPs, has left the party. And I've got to admit, I did a bit of a tweet today where I said, your party MP leaves your party before your party is even a party. I mean, you know, it needs to get its act together pretty quickly, no?
No, absolutely. And one of the things I talked about within my partycraft model was, of course, the acquisition of leadership. Right now, there is no leadership of your party. There's different factions here and there, and we're waiting for a leadership election. We're waiting for the conference, waiting for everything to happen. And yeah, I know the conference is at the end of this month, 28th to 29th in Liverpool. So we'll wait and see what happens there, including maybe the party's name, policy platform, and where it wants to sort of distinguish itself from the Green Party. But yeah, I think your party does need to have that leadership contest as soon as possible, so we can have that leader who can take the message to the country, see what they will do with the Green Party and Zach Polanski, and work out electoral alliances here and there. But yeah, I think it's obviously, I don't think anyone's admitted, Jeremy Corbyn, Tara Sultana or others, that your party's got off to a good start. But despite this 850,000 people initially signing up, and those turning to members, there's about 50,000. That is the largest for a socialist party in the UK since the 1940s, despite everything that's happened. And when we see left-wing parties form all across Europe over the last few years, it's not always been smooth sailing. So we'll wait and see what happens. But it's very interesting because this optimism and energy, it might not have all gone to the Your Party from the 850,000 people signed up, but actually we've seen a growth in the Green Party membership as well. So this energy that has sort of been brought together by Your Party is going somewhere, but it's just not all going to Your Party at the moment. But again, 4 years is going to be a long time in politics. So we'll wait and see what happens. And I think already starting off with the largest party membership for any socialist party in the UK is actually a good start, in my opinion.
And I mean, all parties are coalitions. We all know that. But you know, I mean, I guess it's just been more pronounced in the birth of this new party that, you know, you have from what I can gather, from what I can tell from the media, that you have this very liberal kind of socially liberal Zara Sultana, and then you have, you know, a group of MPs, one of which has exited today, who, from what I can gather, allegedly, I best say, are actually quite socially conservative. And all parties are coalitions, but that's quite a coalition, is it not?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we need to see over the next few months is what your party is going to be, because it's very much just the idea in people's heads, but it will be a real party. It will have a real name. It will have real policies. It will have a leader, and it will have 4 MPs. It was 5 and now 4. So all of this will come together over time, and I think it'll be interesting to see where the battle of ideas take the party in the end. But yeah, like you say, all parties are a coalition. The Liberal Democrats are essentially a coalition of two parties, ideologies that have taken place over the last few decades, and the Conservative Party even so. And I mentioned this in my thesis itself, because the Labour Party very much throughout its history, Conservatives has more tendencies rather than factions, but the Labour Party, is very much 2, 3, maybe even more parties within that over the years, and that coalition has very much fractured. And we saw Labour win, 173 seat majority with 33% of the vote, and that vote is not holding together. So where that share of the vote goes will be very interesting to see. And of course, what this Labour government have done, it will be very interesting to talk about, because Clement Attlee, with 163 seat majority, rebuilt the NHS, built the welfare state, nationalised 20% of the economy, whilst Keir Starmer, with 173 seat majority, has thrown trans people under the bus, cut welfare for the most vulnerable, and have been complicit in genocide in Gaza, and have done so much more to frustrate and fracture their electoral coalition and their core voter base. So where that vote goes, whether it's the Greens or your party, or even the Lib Dems or elsewhere in certain constituencies, will be interesting to see.
And just one final question from me at this point, if that's okay. So we talked about parties in of themselves being coalitions, but then obviously you've got this situation where in many respects the Greens and this new party are saying much of the same things, but I think we could all admit that it's the Greens, and albeit that the Greens are an established party and not having to start afresh, and that's fair enough to say. But I think it's also fair enough to say that Zach Polanski has had, in his terms, a very good start to his leadership. I mean, there'll have to be, a bit like Chris says, there needs to be, amongst the Tories and Reform, there needs to be some kind of understanding, right, between these two parties, because them fighting each other would be pointless.
Absolutely, and the growth of the Green Party is a good thing for progressive politics. To go from 1 MP to 4 MPs, massively increase the share of the vote, now over 140,000 members, and on target to win many constituencies across the country, and even polling second in 2 opinion polls. I think even more now. I think it's 3 now. I think it's absolutely fascinating to see, but I don't think they can do it alone. I think the Green Party, have a certain electoral base to appeal to, and I think it'll be very interesting to see how they do in Leeds, for example. I think they'll do very well in university towns and university cities. I think they'll do phenomenal, and many places in London, for example, in central London, the Greens are targeting, came second in 39 seats, and Zach Polanski is saying this is not ambitious enough. So I think they'll do well, but I don't think they can do it alone. I think, for example, in Liverpool, I think your party are probably best placed to do better there, and in Holborn and St Pancras, we'll see what happens in Islington North and Ilford North as well. But there are community independents and progressives who can win in seats which I think are out of reach for the Greens. But so they can't do it alone. But I would like to see the Greens work with your party, trade unions and community organisations to build that electoral coalition to take on reform in 2029. And I think that's the only alternative, because the Labour Party will not be the alternative to reform in 2029. They have destroyed their electoral base. They've governed very badly. They've not governed progressively, and we need that new progressive alternative.
And Labour's week and how it's been faring this week will be, I should imagine, form a big part of the agenda this week. And before we get on to the main business, I just want to do a shameless plug. I've been on Mathew Goodwin-Freeman's show, a YouTube channel. Mathew Goodwin-Freeman, a good friend of this show, and has appeared on this show many times. He's got his own YouTube channel, Mathew's Blueprint for Britain. I've been on it, and at some point this weekend he'll release that episode. So you'll have a double dose of Dr. Newton this weekend. So aren't you guys lucky?
Well, indeed, aren't we? I mean, we're so lucky, and I imagine that you two just had a lovely time agreeing with each other for the length of that podcast. But actually, I also have some news. Is that Mathew has invited me on his podcast, and I think that'll be. I think that's going to be in a couple of weeks' time. But so I'm really looking forward to that, because up to now, and I'm enjoying his podcast. Matthew is obviously very different politics to mine, but I always say that his box office and our numbers always go up when he's on. So he's clearly a draw. People like him. But I'm looking forward to going on his podcast, because I think I'll be the first person that he has on who is from a very different political point of view. So I think we'll have a good-natured, robust debate. But yeah, so we're both doing his pod, Chris.
Yeah. Look out for the episode today, but also in a couple of weeks' time, Matthew's episode as well. And I'm sure you'll get into a few scraps and debates. So that'll be fun.
And also, whilst we're plugging podcasts, I didn't know we were going to do this, but as we're doing it, I just recently recorded. I mean, something very, very different. But I recently recorded with my friend Paddy Crump. Paddy's a great mate of mine, and he does a mental health podcast called Now We're Really Talking. And I did that, and it's available audio only, but it's available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all the rest. It was. I kind of felt it was a really safe space, discussing with my friends. So, I talked about the loss of my mum and the grief of all of that. I talked a bit about the comfort eating that I did as a result of my mum's death as a coping mechanism. I talked about. Without being too dramatic, but it's just factually the case, almost dying earlier this year and my recovery from that. So it's in rather kind of loose swimming style. I kind of it was my they have the strap at the end of their interviews at the bottom of the screen that says their most open and honest interview ever. Well, this was, I think, my most open and honest interview ever. So if you're interested in that, folks, that's Now We're Really Talking on most podcast platforms.
Yeah, do check that out as well. And thanks, Mathew, for opening up as well. I'm sure people will, in similar situations, will find that helpful and will take some form of comfort. So let's move on to what we're going to discuss today. It's been, pretty a dramatic week, another dramatic week. So the first thing we're going to discuss is sort of the Labour chaos and this alleged coup plot and various other goings on with the Labour government this week. Then we'll talk about the BBC resignations and the row with Trump. Then we'll talk about another junior doctors' strike. And Mathew wants to talk about the Lib Dems. And apparently they've announced a policy this week. My God. So we'll and actually Mathew, I might actually say some good things about the Lib Dems this week. So you never know.
That'll be a first.
Yeah, you're probably right there. Well, I was pretty nice when Andy was here, so it'll be the second time. You
were very kind, but then again, you were outnumbered 2-1.
Yeah, that was true. So that's what we're discussing today. Let's do this, shall we?
Absolutely.
Okay, so our first item, Westminster has been buzzing with rumours this week after reported briefings of a supposed plot to unseat Keir Starmer, either after the budget or following next May's local elections. Names touted as potential leadership contenders include Wes Streeting, Shabana Mahmood, Angela Rayner and Ed Miliband. Streeting denied that he's involved in any plotting and accused Number 10 of fostering a toxic culture. And indeed, Keir Starmer has said that he's assured that Number 10 wasn't involved in any of the briefing. So utter chaos, utter. Again, this whole situation with leadership campaigns and leadership plots, not a great place for Labour. So George, so your reaction to what's been going on, and is this the beginning of the end for Starmer?
So I'm a historian of the Labour Party as well. My thesis covered a lot of history within the Labour Party and how the sort of factionalism has changed over time. The idea of sort of anonymous briefings for leadership challenge has been around for a very, very long time. So whether this comes to fruition, I'm not sure. But nevertheless, I said for years, I said this, years and years and years ago, that the first leadership challenge for Keir Starmer will not come from the Labour left, it will come from the Labour right. I said that years ago, and even in 2022, I said that the worst case scenario would be Keir Starmer versus Wes Streeting on the leadership ballot, and it looks like we're going to get that. And that is not good for the country, because regardless of those two, they seem very much aligned on the fundamental economic orthodoxy when it comes to sort of the same economic policies, when it comes to social policy. Both have been very proactive to throw trans people under the bus and support the Cass review, which has been more and more discredited as time has gone on. So yeah, it doesn't look like fundamentally anything is going to change. And if anything, I think it'd be really interesting to see how the Conservatives respond. Will they stick with Kemi Badenoch, or will they have a leadership challenge in the same way that both parties had a leadership challenge after the European Union referendum in 2016? Jeremy Corbyn won with increased mandate, and then of course we saw Theresa May, who was polling very high in the 50s, and then we saw the general election happen. She won 43% of the vote, Labour 40% of the vote. I don't think Labour under Wes Streeting or Keir Starmer are going to win anywhere near 40% of the vote. And in fact, a leadership challenge or a leadership change is not going to fundamentally change Labour's electoral prospects. I think if anyone is going to change that, it will probably be Andy Burnham in terms of economic policy, constitutional reform, and bringing the Labour Party together. I think that's the only way that the Labour Party can be saved. I don't necessarily want the Labour Party to be saved. The Labour Party has caused a lot of damage in government, and I think we need a progressive alternative. But I think the only lifeline for Labour now is probably Andy Burnham. But what do you both think in terms of the leadership challenge and whether or not it'll come to fruition and whether or not it will save Labour or not?
Well, Mathew, you've got some opinions about Wes Streeting, haven't you?
I have. I mean, I just think that I can't remember a week quite like this. I mean, as George quite rightly says, briefings happen in politics, and that's just a truism. But I don't think I can quite remember a briefing backfiring as much as it has this week. I mean, clearly, and we'll come to who might have done it in a second, but clearly whoever did it felt that this would embarrass Streeting mere hours before he was due to go on the broadcast media rounds the following morning, supposedly to talk about stuff he's doing on the NHS, but then obviously having to deal with all of this as well. And I think any fair person, whatever you think of Wes Streeting's politics, would admit that he's a very good communicator, and he definitely handled that morning round. And actually, I think if we're honest, he came out of that situation strengthened, and Keir Starmer, on whose behalf, whether he knew about it or not, I guess we will perhaps never know, but on whose behalf this briefing was happening, he came out a much diminished figure. And I think I almost sensed at Prime Minister's questions this week that he kind of looked physically diminished. He looked kind of smaller as a political leader. And were it possible, he's come out of this week even less well thought of than he went into it, and he wasn't exactly Mr. Popular in the first place. So I wrote about this on my Substack this week, so folks can go and check that out. But basically, what I argued there was that Labour needs to stop the drama and get on with the delivery, and I think that is the only way that they can conceivably hope to remaining in some kind of competitive place at the next election, is being able to say I doubt they'd quite ever put it in these terms, but to say you may not particularly like us, but we've delivered on this, and this, and that has made your life better. I think that's the only way they can conceivably think about winning the next election or even being competitive. And yet we've got this internal drama. And as I say in my piece, we thought we voted, for those who voted Labour, obviously voted Liberal Democrat, but for those who voted Labour, they felt those who wanted to change, whatever that was, did so because we were fed up of the drama of the 14 Tory years. And yet it feels like a continuation of that. And I think people are are kind of sick to the back teeth of it. And then we hear so now let's come on to who might have been responsible for this. And I guess in a sense we'll never know. I mean, what does people close to Keir Starmer what does that mean if not people in number 10 Downing Street? And I kind of get the impression that Keir Starmer, whenever it was, Thursday I think it was, must have gone to his people in Downing Street and went something like this. Hello, people in Downing Street. Were you responsible for these briefings? No, we weren't. No, they weren't responsible for the briefings. I mean, just absolutely ridiculous. I mean, I was interested. So I was listening to talking to podcasts. I was listening to good old Political Currency with George Osborne and Ed Balls. I was quite shocked to hear, Ed Balls, because a Labour loyalist really, but more of a commentator these days. I was quite shocked to hear him speculate, and I'm assuming with some kind of knowledge of the matter. The person who there'd been so basically what apparently happened was that there was some general briefing that Keir Starmer may or may not have been aware of that he'd fight any leadership challenge. Okay, that's news in of itself. Then apparently someone else went a step further and started naming Wes Streeting. Ed Balls suggested that person, and I'm sure it would be denied, but Ed Balls suggested that person who did that was Darren Jones, MP, Labour MP, fellow minister alongside Wes Streeting, and now in fact Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister, which is a bit of a made-up title, but one of Starmer's head honchos in number 10, that he may have been. Apparently, he doesn't get on with Streeting at all. That Darren Jones is another, ambitious figure, may see himself as a future leader and Prime Minister, and that perhaps he wanted to bring Wes Streeting down a peg or two. So, it's the most kind of Machiavellian thing that I've heard in politics for quite a while. And yet, I'm sure Darren Jones has his talents, but I don't think he's anywhere near as effective an operator or communicator actually as Wes Streeting is. Again, whatever you think of Wes Streeting's politics. Another thing that of note that I didn't realise until I listened to Political Currency, and so I don't mind giving praise to another political podcast. But Ed Balls said there that so when he did the morning round, Wes Streeting kept saying, kind of in the third person in reference to himself, kind of said they shouldn't be kneecapping a minister that's going out there not only making the case for the government but actually delivering on our priorities. Well, according to Ed Balls, this won't just have been some phrase that just came into his head. Apparently, this kneecapping word will have been used because Morgan McSweeney, I don't know if it's his family or what, I can't quite remember, but Ed Balls said that he has some kind of relation to Northern Ireland and something in his family. And so Wes Streeting would have very deliberately used the word kneecapping, knowing that, people in the know would know that what he was on about was that Morgan McSweeney, that he thought that he was behind this briefing. So I mean, goodness me. I mean, rats in a sack doesn't quite cover it, and it does resemble the end of the Tory years. But to be fair to the Tories, and why should I be? But to be fair to the Tories, that was the end of the Tory years. This is after 1 year of Labour. And I mean, to be honest with you, Chris, I can't quite remember a set of circumstances quite like it.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, it's so it took the Tories like several years at least. I mean, if you count the Cameron resignation, about 6 years. If you really want to go into the real psychodrama, sort of 2022 or even 2019, it took the Tories years to get to this stage, and it's taken Labour like, what is it, 17, 18 months? It's ridiculous. It really is. I mean, I thought the government's going to be bad, but I don't think it will be this bad. And then you might say, well, you can talk the Tories were pretty much the same. That's true, and I don't actually have a great deal positive to say about the 14 years of Tory governments. But this has unravelled like pretty much straight away, and it's also taken place during a week, and we're talking about this coup, but there's all this other stuff that's been going on as well. So bad economic figures, 0.1% growth, 5% unemployed. Other stories about this football regulator and being appointed, and having made donations, allegations with regards to the director of communications. It's just. It is just sort of ridiculous, and I just cannot see Labour putting up with it, or the Labour Party sort of putting up with it for much longer, which turns to the question of kind of the leadership and potential leadership contenders. Now, Streeting's been going out in the media and so forth. I know George, said, this wouldn't be a good thing if Streeting sort of became leader or was on the ballot. But a lot of people, I think Streeting's overrated, but a lot of people are saying that Streeting's had a really good week. He's been a very good communicator. He's been humorous, he's been cracking jokes and so forth. A lot of people are saying he's moderate, he's sensible, he's Labour's best shot. But are there other figures maybe on the left of the party that might be more appealing, George?
I don't think so. I think the left of the Labour Party have been very cowardly when it comes to this Labour government. Some of them obviously very much worried about losing the Labour whip for opposing things like the two-child benefit cap, again, which is a Labour leader has never done that before. A Labour leader has never, ever removed the whip just so flippantly. Even Blair, with Jeremy Corbyn, for example, Jeremy Corbyn rebelled over 400 times, and Tony Blair wanted to have Jeremy Corbyn as part of the Parliamentary Labour Party, and there were talks to even suspend, even back in the day in the 2000s. He said, no, don't worry about it. Someone like Jeremy Corbyn is not going to end up being Labour leader as well. And I quote that in one of my chapters, which is very fun because he obviously ended up being Labour leader. But Keir Starmer, he's very much wanting to keep control of the Labour Party. But the problem is, in order to have control of the party, you need to bring people with you. You need to have a vision that inspires. You need one that brings people together. And I think it's sort of this culture of fear has been keeping the Parliamentary Labour Party on board with Keir Starmer. But now they're just seeing him for the sort of serial liar that he is. I've been following Keir Starmer for many, many years. I knew he lied in the 2020 leadership contest. I warned at the time that Labour would take a hard shift to the right, and they did. And anyone who's looked at Keir Starmer's career and how he acted under the Corbyn years and how he's acted as a leader of the opposition, not just in terms of how he acted when he first began the leadership by suspending Rebecca Long-Bailey and then Jeremy Corbyn, but then also just how he acted, the policies he advocated and the policies he dropped. And the problem is, Wes Streeting, Angela Rayner, Ed Miliband, they went along with it. They saw everything that Keir Starmer did in relation to U-turning, in relation to the genocide in Gaza, in relation to everything that this Labour government has done, which has turned its back on progressive people, and they supported it unequivocally and uncritically. And people remember that. Because like I said, I was a former Labour parliamentary candidate under Ed Miliband. I actually had a bit of time for him. But when you look back at his interviews over the last few years, and yes, he's bound by collective cabinet responsibility, but actually we need, in this era of politics, courage and leadership, and actually calling out when you think your party is doing wrong, not just for the sake of the country, but if you care about your party and want to see it survive, you will call out where you think your party's gone wrong. And when we've seen the Cass review that has caused immense damage to trans people across the country, when we've seen the economic policies basically carry on from the last 14 years of Conservative rule, not changing the economic orthodoxy, and seeing living standards continue to decline and squeezed wages and everything like that, the Labour Party are a doomed party, and whoever replaces Keir Starmer, if they have been someone who has supported his leadership or have not stood up against this, or don't fundamentally change the way society works, then I don't really think it makes a difference. But it's a 173 seat majority, 173 seat. They could do whatever they want with this. So any leadership challenge. I think they need to be very bold with their politics, but tinkering around the edges will not change society, and it won't save the Labour Party, in my opinion.
And I've heard, so, I'd agree with pretty much all of that, George, but to add on to that, I've heard people, various commentators say this week something that I've said before, which is not just that Starmer loathes politics, that he loathes the politics of politics, and I don't think you can be an effective party leader or prime minister if you have no interest at all in that side of things. But also that apparently, allegedly, when people try and raise potential problems with him, for example, if it's something to do with the economy, he'll say, "Oh yes, speak to Rachel," or to do with health, "Oh yes, speak to Wes." Like, take some responsibility, man, and actually, be on top of things and. Make some decisions yourself. Apparently, again, I was hearing this week, apparently from people in the know, he likes, his officials, whatever, his advisors, to be in agreement before they put something to him. So he doesn't want to have a battle of ideas put to him and then have to come to a decision. He likes his people, whether it's his advisors or his ministers, to be in agreement, and then he just kind of rubber stamps it. Well, I mean, to me, that is just not leadership. And I get the impression, and again, this isn't a unique thought, others have said it this week, but I get the impression that, he likes being prime minister. He likes swanning off around, and I don't attack him for going around the world, but the British Prime Minister will have to go around the world. But what I mean is that, so I'm not having to go at him for that, but he likes that. He likes the global jet setting. He likes being with the Macrons and the Mark Carneys and all of this. He doesn't want to be having to be bothered about his Labour backbenchers. It reminds me a little bit, Chris, and no doubt you'll have a wry smile at this, but it reminds me a little bit about the last years of Thatcher, when her feel for, and I don't think Starmer ever had this, but Thatcher lost the feel, like the touch that she'd had previously of where the people are. And where her backbenchers were, and she became so kind of grand towards the final years that she didn't want to be bothered with having to go and actually speak to her backbenchers and ask for their vote in leadership contests. And it seems to be the same with Starmer, that he just can't be doing with these little people. They will support me, won't they? Well, no, they won't care, because many of them feel that they're only going to be one-term Labour MPs, and they think, well, if they are only going to be one-term Labour MPs, they don't want to be voting for things that go totally against their founding principles and values. So, I guess Chris, I'd ask you for your viewpoint on this. Can you have, as a prime minister, someone who loathes politics, someone who, when problems are presented to him, says, "Oh, go and speak to whoever or whoever," who wants everything to be a fait accompli before it's put to him? And I say allegedly for all of this, because I don't know, but this is what's been said this week. Why is he there?
No, that's a good question. And you remember that interview where he said he preferred Davos to Westminster? I mean, that sums him up. Right. He prefers being on the world stage. He adheres more to international, he's more concerned with kind of international institutions and international law as opposed to national sovereignty or the nation or indeed the people of the nation. And yeah, it's very strange that someone with that attitude would want to get involved in politics, and he's like he didn't realise that politics kind of involves negotiation and debate and so forth. And the thing is that all of those weaknesses were present when he was leader of the opposition. They were actually present when he was shadow Brexit secretary. But I don't think the media really put him through his paces as leader of the opposition, and therefore he was given an easy ride. And now when he's actually having to do to conduct government, he's been found out, and and there's a lot of things. I mean, the Labour ministers were absolutely, perhaps rightly, crowing when the Tories were going through their psychodramas. Well, being in government isn't actually that easy, and they're finding that, and they're finding that out very quickly. So, and I just think he is utterly unsuitable to be prime minister. He can't communicate. He cannot. His explanations for things are ridiculous, including sort of what you said earlier about the briefings and being assured and so forth that it wasn't one of his staff, and. Yeah, he was supposed to be the transitional leader, and he's ended up being the prime minister, and he's going to absolutely tank, and he is tanking his party as a result. Any final words on this subject before we move on?
There actually is, if you don't mind me saying. I think it was a disgrace, actually, that much of the media did not hold Keir Starmer to account in the way that he should have been, because we saw Jeremy Corbyn, being heavily held to account over any action he did. And you know what? There's a whole argument about whether or not, politicians should be held that much to account, and obviously they should be held to account over policies and stuff like that. I think camping out of his door was pretty disgraceful, and I don't think the media did fairly represent Jeremy Corbyn's arguments, and this has been backed up by research that I looked at in my thesis as well. But nevertheless, it's not so much Jeremy Corbyn I'm interested in, it's more Keir Starmer, because much of the media did not hold Keir Starmer to account, for example, for breaking every single one of his 10 pledges in the 2020 leadership contest. I don't think they care, because they don't, much of the media don't see the left as legitimate political actors, and the 10 pledges were left-wing policy platforms, left-wing policy positions. Much of the media did not hold him to account on the 10 pledges, over his stance over trans rights, which, were warm words in the leadership contest, but didn't sign the Labour campaign for trans rights pledges, and then obviously has got more, not just worse with rhetoric, but also with policies as well, with the Cass review, and obviously, not changing parliamentary legislation to update, which would update the Supreme Court ruling as well, to make things easier for trans people. Like, all of these policy positions, we saw these over the years, and much of the media did not hold them to account. And like you said, Chris, people are finally discovering who Keir Starmer is. He's a serial liar who stands for nothing, and you cannot run a 173-seat majority when you have no vision for the country. So I do think Keir Starmer will probably be gone soon. But this is not just a Keir Starmer problem, this is a Labour Party problem, because much of the Labour Party went with this because they wanted to do everything they could to get into power. The problem is they sold all their principles behind, and now they've lost a lot of their voter base. So it will be interesting to see what happens in 2029 and where that voter base will go. And I genuinely do think by 2029, I'm sorry to say this, Chris, but the Conservatives and the Labour Party, I think the Lib Dems will be, relevant in some constituencies, but the the Labour Party and the Conservatives will not be, the parties on course for government in 2029, in my opinion. I do think it will be reform and some sort of coalition between your party and the Greens, because at the moment we're already seeing Conservatives and Labour on 18%. And Labour are in government. This is not the ceiling. This, and I don't even think it's the floor. I think Labour are going to go down and down, and the Conservatives are having their own crisis at the moment of leadership, whilst Reform are doing very well at mobilising the right-wing base. So we'll wait and see what happens in 2029. But I suppose my question is, if it's all right to ask, do either of you think Labour or the Tories will be in power in the next election?
Go ahead.
So you go, Matthews.
Well, so polls would suggest otherwise, wouldn't they? But many polls, however, have, albeit much further back from reformer. Sadly, from my perspective, obviously, look set to have a massive majority. But recent polls have showed that actually, at the moment, it would be the Lib Dems that would actually be the official opposition. So, I think that would be, so in a sense that would align with what George says. Except George seems to think, and obviously this would suit him more, that it would be Reform versus some kind of left wing alternative. But actually, and obviously the Lib Dems are a left wing alternative to Reform, but you know what I mean. but actually, polls seem to suggest that it would be as the second party. Now, I must admit, I mean, I just don't allow myself to believe that yet that will be the official opposition, and that Ed Davey will be leader of the opposition. But I would be prepared to say that we're in the most volatile period in politics that I can remember, and people don't have the old loyalties. And I think in many respects it's a good thing that they don't. You shouldn't just vote for parties because your grandparents did and your great-grandparents did. But I think people are much more. I think there's a great irony, Chris and George, that I think in one sense people are at the same time really sick of politics and sick of politicians, but also in some senses more engaged and prepared to look outside the box than they've ever been. So it's a weird kind of dichotomy. I mean, I would just point out one or two other things. So one is that it's really interesting that Wes Streeting has been attacking left in a lot of his comments. We know that he faces, and he did say just today, I believe, he was doing morning interviews again today, and apparently he said that he will be fighting Ilford North because there'd been some speculation that he was going to do the chicken run to a safer seat. He said today that he is going to fight Ilford North. That leaves his potential. No, I mean, he may go back on that, but that's what he said today. So we can only go on what he said. But that leaves any potential leadership challenge, a bit hampered, because at the moment it looks like he won't retain his seat, and surely Labour is not going to want to elect a leader who is very unlikely to retain their seat. So I think he'd have a lot of convincing to do that he is going to do the work needed to retain his seat from his perspective. I mean, again, I think, he did very nearly lose his seat last time, on the issue of Gaza, along with a number of other Labour MPs. I mean, he's been, since then, obviously because he's felt he's had to, he's been, saying quite a lot about the Israel-Gaza situation and a number of other things. Now, do I genuinely think that Wes Streeting has had a Damascene conversion to left-wing Labour politics? No, I clearly don't think that. He's more Blairite than Blair. But equally, I think that I'm afraid rather in the Starmer mould, as George has said, he knows that to win the Labour leadership, you can't do that from the Blairite right of the party. So he's clearly doing what he has to do. But I have to say, let's just be, the realpolitik of this week is that Streeting ends the week stronger than he started it, and Starmer ends the week weaker than he started it, and he was already pretty darn weak. So I mean, I just don't know when. I mean, surely we can't see another reset from Starmer, and this would be about the fourth or fifth reset if we do. I mean, it starts getting
300.
It starts getting a bit embarrassing, doesn't it, if it's not already? But Labour are not in a good place. And let's remind ourselves, I don't think we've even really touched on the economy yet. I mean, let's remind ourselves that this is 2 weeks out from a make or break budget, where the latest briefing, and talk about briefing, some more briefing, the latest briefing is that Starmer and Reeves are they're going to apparently stick to the manifesto pledges, and they're not going to be raising those taxes. Well, okay, but then what on earth, how on earth are they going to resolve the financial mess that they've got themselves in? So, I mean, I don't see things getting any better for this Labour government. I think the budget, unless Reeves pulls something out of the hat that none of us are expecting, and I suppose she might, but I think that's unlikely. And if she doesn't, then that is going to be another point of danger for Starmer. And then, of course, he's got the elections next May, when he'll be the first Labour leader not to win Wales, right? So there's that, where he's set to lose hundreds, if not thousands, of council seats, and where it's very unlikely that they'll become the government in Scotland. So I cannot see the Starmer leadership and premiership going anything beyond next May at the very latest.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And to answer George's question, I think his his scenario is a possibility. It's a real possibility in respect to Labour and the Tories not being the main contenders. I think in terms of the Tories, I think the problem that they have is that Farage and George is in a better position to perhaps to comment on this given his work. But Farage has really kind of established himself very early on and established a kind of a lodgement, a beachhead. And Badenoch's getting better. She's getting better at Prime Minister's questions. But the question is it too late, given that Farage has really established himself as the figurehead of the right, and the Tories are going to have a hell of a lot of work trying to change that and trying to dislodge that, and it's very difficult to see. But unless Farage slips on a proverbial banana skin or something happens, then the reform project becomes much more precarious, because it is essentially just Nigel Farage at the moment. So it's interesting. So you could see a splintering as we're seeing at the moment, a European style situation, or we could see the movements morphing. Just as the Whigs and the Tories sort of morphed into the Liberals and the Conservatives, we could see something different, a two-party system still, but something sort of different. The two parties sort of calling themselves something different. I don't know, to be honest. I don't know which is going to happen at this stage.
And just very, very small, quick point, and I would say this, wouldn't I? But you've just made the point there, Chris. And I say again, I've said it again before on this podcast. We're becoming a European-style democracy without the European-style voting system, and I think it just. I know Chris will hate this, but I think it's becoming, with each day, first past the post is becoming more and more unsustainable to justify. And I think, before too very long, it'll go, and we'll have the system that we clearly need for the multi-party democracy that we have, and that is a properly proportional system.
For full transparency, just to add to a quick point that you've both made, the thing is, the Conservatives, like you say, you just got to wait for reform to slip up. But that is it at the moment. The Conservatives, no matter what they do, it's sort of beyond their control. But I do take the point, like Matthew's saying, for full transparency, I've been a big advocate for electoral reform for well over a decade now. I was the former youth officer for the Labour campaign for electoral reform way back when. But even back then, for example, 2017, 83% of people voted for the two parties, Labour and the Conservative Party. So even back then, there was maybe a stronger case for first past the post, single member plurality, whatever you want to call it. But right now, it is very much a seven-party system, and we saw in July last year 33% of the vote winning a supermajority in Parliament. I don't think that is a system that is sustainable under a seven-party system, in my personal opinion. Malta is a two-party system that uses proportional representation, and there are multi-party democracies that you do use first past the post. But I think in the UK right now, if we stick with it, we're going to end up with those disproportionate results for a very long time. 2015 was very disproportionate, but 2024 was the most disproportionate of all time, on the lowest electoral turnout of all time as well. And this isn't even going into the key arguments in favour of electoral reform, but mainly just talking about how disproportionate elections are at the moment. So I think it'd be really interesting to see, and actually it'll be interesting to see how the Conservatives respond to this, because Reform are in favour of electoral reform, as are the Green Party. The Labour Party conference are, but the Labour Party are not, due to Keir Starmer's leadership, because they don't see Parliament as sovereign, or they only see it as sovereign when conference is sitting, therefore it's not binding. But yeah, I think this will be an interesting policy discussion, constitutional reform for 2029, and Andy Burnham to support that as well. So if he is going to run for leader, then I do think this will be a big talking point by the next election. But we'll wait and see.
Chris, can I ask you, just before we leave this item, I tweeted this week, and it's very rare for me to say anything nice about Kerry Badenoch and the Tories, but I thought she had her best outing ever from her perspective this week. I thought, it was an open goal, and really, I think it would have probably done for her leadership had she not kicked the ball into the back of the net. But to be fair, she did, and I thought Starmer, who, as I say, I think he looked almost physically diminished on Wednesday. But he, as others again have noted, it was interesting that he wasn't able to go back to her as just a few weeks ago he would have been able to do, to say, well, you're talking about my leadership. What about your leadership? He wasn't able to say that. I mean, it's right to say that she is in a bit of a stronger position, right?
Yes, as I said, she's a lot better now. She's a lot more aggressive. She follows up her questions. She did that weird thing at the start where she would ask a question on one thing and then go off on another issue and never really pin Starmer down. She stopped doing that. She's doing what I said. I've been saying all along on this podcast what she should be doing, and her performances have got a lot stronger. I think her aggression is actually good. She needed that as well. But the question is anybody taking any notice? Is anybody out there taking any notice? I'm not sure. I don't know. The polls are still 16%. It will take a long time for those, I should imagine, to change. She is showing her potential. I think some of us, thought that she had potential, but is it a bit too late now? It might just be, but we'll have to see there. If it's okay, I'll move on to the next item, which is a favourite subject of ours, the BBC. So the BBC has been thrust into a full-blown crisis after the shock resignations of Director General Tim Davie and new CEO Deborah Turnus. The departures came on the heels of a leaked internal memo alleging deep systemic bias inside the corporation. The memo detailed how Panorama had misleadingly edited footage of Donald Trump's 6th of January 2021 speech in the 2024 broadcast, a revelation that prompted Trump to threaten legal action, and the deadline for that is today. So either the BBC offers a convincing enough apology or Trump sues. And the fallout is still widening, given that it's since emerged that Newsnight similarly spliced Trump's speech in a 2022 programme. So is there a problem with the BBC and bias, and what do we make of Trump threatening to sue the corporation? George?
I think a world leader, threatening to intervene with the BBC, I think is a concerning thing, and considering that taxpayers' money could be going straight to Donald Trump, I do think that's a concern. Do I have much sympathy for the BBC? I don't, because actually I think the way the BBC have behaved when it comes to political reporting, I've had big critiques over the last decade or so, treating migrants crossing the channel like it was a game, the way that the genocide in Gaza has been portrayed by the BBC, refusing to commit a genocide, and so much other reporting which has been really awful in relation to the conflict in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza. But also as well, in my thesis I had a look at the way that the BBC treated, how the BBC reported Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party. And I have to say, I think the reporting was really substandard at times. For example, at the end of one Newsnight segment, presenting Jeremy Corbyn as Voldemort. One time, obviously the whole imposing a Soviet-style hat on him, and all these other little things that are just shouldn't be meaningful. And of course the BBC can parody and all these things. The problem is it was a consistent pattern of behaviour that undermined, the core messages and the way that, the leader of the opposition was supposed to be portrayed. He's supposed to be seen as a legitimate political actor. In this case, she's supposed to be seen as a legitimate political actor. And that is the case. Anybody who is leader of the opposition should be given a fair hearing by the BBC. And as I stated extensively in my thesis, not just the BBC, but much of the media did not give Corbyn a fair hearing, whilst at the moment they seem to be giving Reform a massive platform. Yes, they're ahead in the polls. Yes, they do have 5 members of Parliament. And yes, they should have political representation in the media. That's fair. I do think, however, it has been very disproportionate in favour of Reform, and the way they treat the left as legitimate political actors is just not the case. And I know they had Zara Sultana on yesterday, and they've had Zach Polanski on, and they've had Corbyn on, and other left-wingers on over the years. But you really, like, the way the BBC have been covering certain issues has been really, really disgraceful. And there was even another one which I had to complain to the BBC about, saying that Corbyn was Corbyn was expelled from the Labour Party over anti-Semitism, something which is not true. He was expelled from the Labour Party for standing as an independent candidate, and was suspended for initially saying that the issue of anti-Semitism had been dramatically overstated by political opponents inside and outside the party. When Simon Heffer says that Jeremy Corbyn is going to reopen the gates of Auschwitz, that is one example of the issue being weaponised and not being treated, in a way that is, the issue of anti-Semitism is extremely serious, and it shouldn't be treated so trivially. And I think Simon Heffer saying that and other things that have been said about Jeremy Corbyn, I don't think were treated fairly. And I think that specific report by Vicky Young, was really disgraceful, and I complained to the BBC over it, and unfortunately the response wasn't as I wanted. But nevertheless, I still feel that was right to do, and I held them to account via social media for that, and got a lot of response. But so yeah, there is bias within the BBC, but it's certainly not an anti-Trump bias. So it might be actually to an extent, but it's certainly not like a left-wing bias as such. I think the way that they sort of looks at the 2024 US election, I do feel they were very much more pro-Harris than Trump in their reporting. I don't think it was like necessarily the most fair or impartial reporting I've seen, but it wasn't like, something that would treat Trump as an illegitimate political actor, whilst they did in many ways treat Jeremy Corbyn as an illegitimate political actor at times as well. So yes, there are issues with the BBC when it comes to bias and anti-left-wing bias. I don't want to see a single penny of taxpayers' money going towards Donald Trump. So yeah, I think that's a sort of summary, and I'm happy to elaborate on that. But yeah, what do you both think?
I'll respond to that in a minute, but Mathew.
Yeah, thank you. So, look, I broadly agree with George. I feel like I've been discussing this a lot this week because I did a debate on Talk on Tuesday, I think it was, about this whole issue, and then I wrote my Lib Dem Voice column on it as well. And my main thrust has been, and I absolutely agree with George, that the BBC is far from perfect. As I said on Talk, no human institution ever is. Look, we Lib Dems have had very much our issues with the BBC and the fact that, it has ultra-platformed Farage, and yet, my lot, whatever people may think of the Lib Dems, the fact is we've got 72 seats at the moment, with the largest third force in the Commons in a century, and I think it's pretty damn disgraceful and unjustifiable that we are not on... really, we should be, I think, legitimately, given 72 seats, we should be on more panels than we're not. And if you think of the pre-coalition days, when we had far fewer seats than we have now, George mentions question time, it would be the case pretty much all the time that there'd be, someone from Labour, someone from the Conservatives, someone from the Lib Dems, and then maybe some other people as well. And I don't quite know why that isn't the case anymore. So the Lib Dems have got, I think, a legitimate grievance against the BBC, and yet we also find ourselves in this tricky position because, we very much support the BBC when it's at its best, and it is one of the, I described it this week as one of the last defences against the more toxic elements in both our media and our politics. So it's a bit of a tricky position for us in that sense. But I mean, I agree with Ed David when he said this week that we support the BBC at its best, and that we'd be our media plurality would be a lot less well off without it, especially in a situation, in an era where, and again, I go on Talk. I've been on GB News, albeit only just the once thus far, hope to go on again. And I think those more opinion, whatever you think of them, I think those opinion channels, I don't think they're news channels, but I think those opinion channels have their place. But I also think that we need pretty straight down the line, news channels as well, where people can get trusted news. And look, I mean, I said on Talk that I think the fact that, and actually it's evidenced here because, all three of us could probably attack the BBC in our own way. I think the fact that they get attacked from left, right and centre probably shows that most of the time they're in just about the right place. And I can see George shaking his head, but I think most of the time they probably they probably are, and I think they're always going to be attacked because they're not always going to please. I think the difficulty with the public today and the political commentariat of which the three of us are a part is that we always want to hear said back to us what we already believe, and I just don't think that is a viable position to be in. And one of the reasons why I really enjoy going on Talk and GB News is because I like the idea that when I go on, right, that their viewers and listeners who obviously have a particular point of view, otherwise they wouldn't be tuning in. I like the idea that for a few minutes they have to hear someone who is saying things that they don't like, that is coming from an alternative political position. And I know that I'm effective when they get callers and listeners emailing in and going on air saying, "Oh, that Mathew Hulbert, he's talking rubbish." Yeah, I know I've had an effect. I know that they have had to hear, they've had to listen to a different point of view.
And people.
Yeah, and I they love me. But I like that idea. I like the idea that, and so that's why I kind of force myself sometimes, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but clearly it's not my politics. I force myself sometimes, even when I'm not on, of tuning into these channels and others and reading kind of print publications that I know fully well that I don't agree with, because especially as a commentator, you should want to know what the full range of opinions are, even if some of them you'll disagree with. And so I'm no problem with media plurality, but equally I think there needs to be some things like the BBC and Sky News and ITV News, Channel 4 News and others. Channel 4 News, I guess you could legitimately argue is pretty left-wing. Is kind of known for that, but I think the BBC, Sky, and ITV, the vast majority of the time, try and report in a way which is pretty down the line. Now, do they always succeed? Do they often succeed? Well, probably not. But I think they do a good job in very tough circumstances. And as I also said on Talk this week, let's face it, there's commercial rivals of the BBC who would love the BBC not to be there anymore. And actually, I think we should be very wary of that. I think, I think Farage would like it to be some subscription-based thing. I think the moment you turn the BBC into a commercial enterprise, it's lost its point in being. And I know that some people think the licence fee is a poll tax. Whatever you want to call it, I'm not bothered about, but I think that the licence fee is a legitimate way for the BBC to be funded. Do the BBC make mistakes? Yes, they do. But we've seen this week that some might argue the BBC has been more accountable than some political parties when things go wrong. I mean, ultimately, the head is gone and the head of news is gone. And I don't think you can really ask for much more than that.
Okay, right. I've got a lot to say about all that. I mean, firstly, on the issue of Trump. I mean, at the end of the day, BBC is in the business of publishing and broadcasting. It's subject to the same libel laws that everybody else is subjected to. If someone feels, and it regardless of whether it's the President of the United States or whoever feels that the BBC has libeled them, they are entitled to make a case. And it's not for me to say whether they did or not. It's for a court to say that. but they are liable to have that as much as anything else. Although the splicing wasn't a good look. It isn't a good look. I mean, I think people can see that if you take two bits of a speech, which is 50 minutes apart, and put them together, that's not good practice.
But Chris, can I just challenge you on that though, Chris? Because I said on talk that they clearly shouldn't have done that, or they should have said, this is from this point in the speech, this is from this point in the speech. I agree with that. But I think the broad thrust of the argument is correct, that Donald Trump refused to accept the democratic result of a legitimate election because in his mind he can never lose. Well, he did lose, and Joe Biden legitimately, democratically became US president. And I think you'd be pretty hard up to try and argue that he didn't, and let's just be careful in what word we use here, that he didn't have some role in what transpired on January 6th, 2021. So I mean, I think the broad thrust of what was argued in that documentary was correct. At the same time as they should have been clearer about what points in the speech those bits were from.
Well, again, I don't think even if you believe that, it doesn't justify the splicing. I mean, I would say that there are points of that speech that you can point to which says that his language was more tempered. The peacefully and patriotic line, and then there are lines like "we will fight" again, which people have interpreted as having some kind of meaning. But if you look at, for example, Keir Starmer's speech, in the conference speech, he was using similar lines. He was saying that we will fight you, we will come battle armed. So is Starmer in the do we condemn Starmer in the same way? I mean, there are political metaphors like fight. That we use, and I'm trying to be fair here because I'm not like massive 100% Trump fan. I've criticised him countless times on GB News on his foreign policy or aspects of his foreign policy. But I'm just trying to be fair there. In terms of whether the BBC's biased, you see, I just. It's an interesting question to explore. I just see it like completely differently. I just see and there's lots of evidence to back up, and you'll see that a lot of the criticism, most of the criticism of the BBC, yes, Corbynists do criticise the BBC, but most of the criticism has come from the right, and the people who have defended the BBC over the past week, tend to be establishment left, and that may be why me and George have different views about the BBC, different views about which way the BBC is biased. But ultimately we believe it's biased because it's establishment left. Although the younger people there, I think, are more probably inclined towards the Corbyn green kind of view, and then there may be a bit of a battle between the establishment left and the new left. But in terms of, I just have to say, George, I just see it very differently. In terms of the coverage of the boats, they were very slow to actually do that. Yes, I mean we disagree on Gaza. We disagree on the genocide point. We're not. I don't. If we have an argument on that, we're going to take us way off the topic. But again, you can point to examples like the Al Ali Hospital, where they reported it was an Israeli strike, but it turned out to be either Hamas or one of the militia's rockets that hit the hospital instead, and the using of Hamas's figures sort of uncritically. And there's lots of reports, Civitas, the IEA. have all sort of came up with research which illustrate during the Brexit years that they were panelling Remainers much more heavily than Brexiteers or people with favouring withdrawing the from the EU on shows like Question Time and the BBC as well. And also you've got former executives, Roger Mosley, Helen Bowden, former presenters, Andrew Neil, John Humphreys, Peter Sissons, so there is. I know I'm never going to convince you to of this. There is a lot.
All right wingers that you've just named.
Well, not the executives. They're not right wingers.
Robbie Gibb, give me a break.
Mark Thompson, is he right wing?
Well, Robbie Gibb is certainly, basically conservative apparatchik.
Yeah, but even Robbie Gibb, who did he work for? He worked for Theresa May and Francis Maude. Hardly the most right-wing Conservative MPs there, are they? But and Robbie Gibb and Tim Davie, they were like two in a sea of kind of lefties. So. And how much influence did they have in the end anyway, if you've got this report? And again, we've got to mention the report and the memo, which outlines, a lot of examples of left-wing bias as well. Now, I know I'm not going to convince you to, but no. that's kind of my pitch. But I do think it's interesting that especially me and George, believe it's biased, and maybe it's because it's pro-establishment. That's probably one of the reasons why we think that way.
Yeah, go on, George.
Yeah, I was going to say there's quite a few points have been raised that. So, for example, Mathew, you said about with the BBC, with left, right, centre, they're all complaining. Therefore, you might genuinely believe. Therefore, it's annoying everyone. Therefore, it's doing its job right. You may genuinely believe that, and there might be a coherent argument to that. The problem with my argument with that is that it helps the BBC avoid accountability for this, because they'll just use that as a line rather than actually addressing the core points with their bias. We'll just say we're annoying everyone. Therefore, we're doing our job right. I think it's used as a way to sort of escape that. Now, Chris, there was a few points raised there, and I think you and I fundamentally agree that the BBC is pro-establishment. Now, we may disagree with, whether it's establishment left. I'd be interesting to see what your interpretation of what that means is, considering the BBC being very proactive against, for example, trans rights and the debate around trans rights, and indeed the genocide in Gaza too. You mentioned the point about, the hospital, the IDF claimed it was Islamic Jihad that did it. But what about every other hospital that has been bombed in Gaza? The entire infrastructure of the country has been destroyed, whether it's every single hospital, pretty much 80% of Gaza has been completely destroyed to the ground. And the reason why I'm concerned about that is because, obviously horrific humanitarian consequences, millions of people impacted. And now the critique that you raised was that the BBC have been uncritically, promoting these sort of figures promoted by Hamas when it comes to the death toll, for example. You might not have said death toll specifically, but that's one. But the death toll, when it comes to the genocide in Gaza, that is a very, very low estimate, with the Lancet and other academics believing the death toll to be significantly higher, up to 700, 800,000 people, which is a lot smaller than the figures produced by the Hamas-run health authority. And the BBC, I think when it comes to that, you might raise the point about the hospital there, but what about every other hospital that has been bombed to the ground? People going through surgeries without anaesthesia and all these things, bombs going off every single day, people dying every single day, a genocide according to genocide scholars, an independent report by the United Nations, Amnesty International, and so many more. Have the BBC given them a fair hearing? I don't think they do, because you and I might disagree with that, but in my personal opinion, I think this reporting is going to sort of genocide denial levels of state propaganda. And I'm really concerned about that, because the consequence of that, when we've been learning about genocide over the last few decades, we repeat the lessons. This will not happen again. We'll make sure this does not happen again. Never again for anyone. But we have seen a genocide in real time, and we've seen how the BBC have reported on this, and now hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have been murdered in Gaza, and the West Bank is next. And we're seeing acts of violence against people in the West Bank every single day, and the violence against the people in Gaza still continues today. Have the BBC actually reported on that in a way which, actually does hold the Israeli government to account over this? I don't think they have, and there's been report after report, internal investigations in the BBC showing that there is anti-Palestinian bias when it comes to that reporting. So I do agree with you that it is pro-establishment. I don't understand where establishment left comes from. It'll be interesting to hear, considering on social policies, when it comes to discussions about welfare, for example, BBC Question Time. These are never sort of like left-leaning discussions on welfare anymore. Under the Corbyn years, I do think the Overton window did shift to allow more discussion over austerity, over social rights, etc. Even Theresa May accepting austerity is over. I don't believe her, but she used those words, and actually supporting self-ID for trans people. This is not the case anymore. The Overton window has shifted so much to the right, and the BBC, if their duty is to be impartial, I don't think they've done a very good job at that, in my personal opinion, when it comes to the genocide in Gaza, when it comes to treating the left as legitimate political actors, and so much more, in my opinion.
But George, if the BBC, at its best at least, still has an important role, given that there's so many views stations where people can just go and have their point of view reinforced to them, to actually have a channel which at least seeks, it would argue, to report things in a responsible way. I mean, I think we'd all have our issues with that, but at least in theory, there's got to be a place for proper news outlets, right?
In theory, yes, absolutely. If the BBC was acting as it said on the tin, I think that'd be a very good thing for democracy. I think it'd be good to have an impartial broadcaster who's able to treat legitimate political actors with fair discussion, and indeed allowing views from all wings to sort of be heard. And I think that would not be a bad thing for democracy, rather than sort of turbocharged, GB News promoting right-wing views, etc., etc. The problem is the BBC doesn't do that. It's very much a voice for the establishment, and unfortunately, it's just not acted in a very in a way that has been perceived to be, at least by some people, not to be impartial. And for me, at the very least, the Corbyn years were a big eye-opener for me. The genocide in Gaza was just another example of the BBC's really bad reporting. I think it's very important that actually we support community media outlets that are really caring about things that are happening within local areas. I think community and independent media is very important. And I think we need to be relying much more on that rather than relying on the BBC, and taking our sort of views from as many outlets as possible there. And I think when it came to the genocide in Gaza, the BBC were really not a good place to look at, so people were looking elsewhere. But yeah, like you say, if the BBC were doing that, that'd be great. And I think there could be a place for the BBC. And obviously, I hope at the end of the day, if the licence fee pay were to end and it were to be privatised and everything like that, I do think that would be very bad for democracy, because I think it would just turbocharge it being a sort of establishment or right-wing outlet, in my opinion. Maybe, I've advocated for... Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, George, that, and again, I would say this, wouldn't I? But there's a place for podcasts like this, right, which have a range of views, has polite but robust debates about the issues of the day. And, we have people on from left, right and centre, literally. And, I think people are more and more turning to, podcasts and vlogcasts and all the rest of it for their news stroke opinion coverage.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Zach Balansky having his own podcast, Bold Politics, and I think Novara Media being a presence as well, having full-time staff to report on issues from a left-wing perspective, that's good for democracy. Whether you may agree or disagree with Zach Balansky and Novara, I think having those spaces are extremely important for our democracy. I don't think we need any more establishment voices, in my opinion. So having that independent media, community media, I think is really good, in my opinion. What about both of you?
Well, I just think we've, the media landscape has completely changed, and we've got Netflix, we've got Amazon, we've got all of these different outlets. Obviously, we've had Sky and cable for quite a while now, and there's just, there's just a lot of choice now, and a lot of services and a lot of niche subjects are being catered for in this new landscape. I think the BBC is too big. I think it should be privatised. Now, should there be a small public service element, broadcaster to do sort of big occasions, state occasions, free sport, that kind of thing, political news coverage, an actual impartial news coverage. Maybe I'm thinking, mulling over whether we should still have that. And again, I don't like I say, I was a bit wary because we could have like an endless discussion about the BBC's coverage on Gaza, but I would like to sort of kind of put on record what I think in terms of the figures. There's research to suggest that Hamas, for example, conflates combatants with non-combatants. The BBC has focused a lot on Gaza, and some say rightly, given the nature of the conflict and so forth. But I didn't see much BBC broadcast coverage of the massacre in El Fasher, which is an actual, deliberate, intentional massacre in Sudan. Or against the Druze in Syria, and that so those kinds of events they haven't really covered, and also have they covered that when the Israelis do bomb a hospital, do they say that the reason why they have bombed this hospital is because there's military infrastructure either in the hospital or underground the hospital, and that international and that the law of armed conflict says that you can bomb a hospital if it is being used for military purposes, providing that they follow through
every single hospital?
The various protocol.
Chris,
every single hospital.
So, guys, I'm a little bit worried that we're going to go down a rabbit hole that we've just not got time for.
That's why I was
on this episode.
But there's been war crimes. There's been war crimes, and the BBC needs to report on that. The BBC needs to report on war crimes.
Well,
absolutely. Guys,
that's why we have investigations to ascertain that.
Yeah. So guys,
let's wait until the investigation, shall we, and then see what's happened.
Guys, I think we should have George back on and we'll have him back on anyway because he's been fab. But I think we'll have George back on when this is a main issue that we're talking about. Because I've got things to say about it. I've got things to say about it as well, but I just don't think that's this week.
Yeah. So you're right. You're right.
So finally on the BBC. So finally on the BBC, just one final sentence. I think that. I personally think they can't win whatever they do is the honest truth, and so I would end by saying that by and large they do a pretty good job in very, very trying circumstances. And I would also totally disagree with you, Dr. Chris. I think that the licence fee must continue, and in actual fact. And I know both of you might shake your heads at this, but I think actually there's been far too many cuts at the BBC forced by very ungenerous licence fee deals. So I'd actually like to see a bit more money going to the BBC. Then perhaps we wouldn't see these mistakes.
Maybe. Could be right. The issue might be funding. I do think there's an institutional problem when it comes to this, but I think it's an interesting point of view. And obviously, what is the alternative? I think is very interesting. I don't think the road to privatisation is the way. And I said many, many years ago, if the government were, for example, to sell its stake in Channel 4, I think actually that I think it'd be great for trade unions to actually buy their fair share to make sure that there is still an outlet there. That are promoting this. I think Channel 4 is investigative journalism is absolutely phenomenal, and they're not afraid to shy away from, for example, the genocide in Gaza, but also atrocities that are committed around the world, actually. I think when it comes to foreign policy, Channel 4 seem to be a lot better than the BBC, and I think selling that public stake would be a bad thing. And I think, I think progressives should work together to try and ensure that the Channel 4 is still floating afterwards. But I think that's a whole other discussion as well. But yeah, I think the BBC needs serious reform.
Okay, right. Let's move on, shall we? We discussed that quite a bit. So we have discussed this before on the podcast. So we'll perhaps discuss this perhaps briefly, or let George have most of the running here. But we are going to discuss the junior doctors' strike. So the junior doctors have launched yet another 5-day walkout, the 13th since March 2023, as their long-running dispute with the government continues. The BMA says the profession is in crisis and is demanding a 26% pay rise to restore pay to 2008 levels. So they had a pretty big pay rise last year. Is another strike necessary, or do they risk losing the public if they keep going on these strikes? George?
Well, what matters to the workers are their working conditions and their pay. And we saw in the 2022, the summer of discontent, we did see a lot of opinion polls published on, for example, the UCU strikes, the train strikes, and the junior doctor strike. I've not seen polling for this year, so I think that'll be interesting to look at. But they're doing what they feel is right. And, I've been on strike before when I was a member of UCU. And I just, the conditions that, in academia, you'll know that it has been really awful when it comes to casualisation, when it comes to low pay and everything like that. We're talking about the future of healthcare right here. And, junior doctors, they're demanding pay back to 2008 levels. I think that's an extremely reasonable demand. And I think actually more of us should be demanding pay rises and joining unions and having that collective responsibility together to fight for those pay rises, because I think that's absolutely right to do. We've seen wages stagnate over the last 15 years, and this does include the 14 years of Conservative rule, but also under the Labour government as well. We've seen wages rise, but when have we seen the cost of living rise significantly more as well? I think right now it's a very, very bad position for junior docs to be in, who sacrifice so much already, and this is not a decision made very lightheartedly. I've been when I was in Leeds doing my PhD, I was regularly supporting the RCN and other healthcare unions because the university is right by the hospital there. And we heard lots of different stories about people going on strike and how it was not an easy decision, people obviously giving up their wages for the day, but they're fighting for what they think is right. And I think fighting for a pay rise in line with how it should have been over the last few years, if pay would have just kept in line with prices over the last few years, I think it's a good thing that they're doing. I think they should be given our full solidarity. I think it's really, really important that if you care about the future of healthcare, back your junior doctors, because otherwise people are going to be leaving the profession. As we've seen in academia, so many people leaving the profession, which is lowering the standard of academia. And that's one thing. But when it comes to healthcare, which can impact any single one of us at any time in our lives, I think it's extremely important that we are on the side of staff who know what it's like day to day there. And I think it's very important that they are, there are negotiations to go ahead. I fully support their demands, but at the end of the day, I think the important thing is that there are negotiations to get around the table and to talk about a deal for this year. And I think that's really, really important.
Mathew, so what do you make of this? Do you, obviously you would agree with this, but there isn't an endless pit of gold. The way some would argue, and I would be one of them, would argue that actually the starting salary, the Nuffield Trust estimates around about 38,000 pounds is pretty good for a starting salary, and is the are the unions, are they do they risk losing the public support here, given that they've had a pay rise, a big pay rise last year? So what do you think, Mathew?
Yeah, so a few things on this. So first of all, just to say, I'm a trade unionist. I'm a member of Unison, and proud to be so. I support the resident doctors. I think they are just asking for pay parity, and that is not unreasonable for them to do so. But I will admit that yes, I mean, I think people are prepared to go so far in support of striking workers, and at some point there is, rightly or wrongly, fairly or unfairly, there's a moment where actually people think, up with this, we will not put anymore. Now, whether we've reached that, I like to think we haven't, and it'll be interesting to see what polling says about that. But look, I think these people work in often very difficult conditions. They have life and death decisions to make literally every day. These are the people caring for us. These are the people that were caring for me when I had my major health incident earlier in the year. And they should be properly paid, and that and as I say, they're not asking for more, they're asking for pay parity, and that is what I think they should be entitled to get. So myself and actually the campaign group that I work with, Just Treatment, are supporting the resident doctors. But yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with you, Chris. There may come a point, we may have reached it, I hope not, but there may come a point where public sympathy moves from the resident doctors, and I think that would be an issue for them in their ongoing fight. But actually, if you're asking who is the more popular, resident doctors or Starmer's Labour government, I think the resident doctors have got that pretty much in the bag. And we all know, don't we, in fights like that it's often, if people dislike your opponent more than they dislike you, you'll retain a good proportion of their sympathy. And I think that's where we're at the moment. But yeah, I mean, I'm really interested to see what polling looks like, and to hear what most people are thinking about this, Chris.
And we talked about Res Streeting earlier. I remember, during the Tory government, Res Streeting was very cocky, and he's saying that the Tories are being antagonistic, and they just need to sit down and negotiate, and everything will be okay, and so forth. Now I heard him on the radio this morning on LBC, and he sounded like a Tory. And he was very aggressive towards, justifiably, in my opinion, towards the BMA. So what do we think of Streeting's handling of things?
He is basically a Tory, you're right. And I think, when it comes to economics, there's not much that separates him from that Conservative government. Genuinely, sincerely, when you look at the actual, not just the rhetoric when it comes to junior doctors. And I know there was a pay deal negotiated this time, and I do think the Conservatives were really lacklustre when it came to getting the negotiations done. But I think your point, Mathew, if people are going to pick between junior doctors and Keir Starmer, I think people are going to be on the side of junior doctors. But at the end of the day, even if they did lose popular support for whatever reason, they're still doing the right thing, and they still should be supported, in my opinion. Whether or not to, I again, like I dare say, I support their demands, but at the very least, people should be on their side to at least back them to get around the negotiating table, because that's what they want, and I think that's a good thing. So, at the end of the day, the future of healthcare is so important, and I think we do need to listen to junior doctors.
Okay, right. Any last words on this, Mathew? I mean, I've said on this podcast before, my solution is that some of the doctors they go off to Australia or somewhere because of the pay, and my opinion is just well, why don't we just create alternatives for them in this country, and still free at the point of use, but I'm very open to involving all the sectors, both private and charitable sectors, and maybe there we can have some competition in terms of price.
Chris, I think we should move on to the Lib Dems now.
Okay. Okay, right. Lib Dem time. Because we must do this every week. We must have a segment on the Lib Dems.
Yes,
So
you must.
I'll hand to, so actually the Lib Dems, they held a press conference this week, maybe Farage has one or two things to teach them, and they actually announced a policy this week. So this is a policy on VAT. So what do you make of it, Mathew? Is this a step in the right direction?
Well, there I was watching BBC News this week when suddenly up pops Daisy Cooper, my party's deputy leader, who I know well, and our Treasury spokesperson as well, doing a live press conference in a pub, making a speech, taking questions. I thought, good, because this is what I've been calling for on this podcast for a long time, that, we need to be announcing things and getting the media to hopefully cover us and having something to say. So I was really pleased to see this, and we've called for a 5% VAT cut for pubs and restaurants. I think that will be quite a popular policy, especially at a time when so many pubs are closing each week up and down the country. But even more than just the policy, Chris, which I think it's a good policy, but even more than the policy, I think it was just it warmed my heart, it gladdened my heart to see us being proactive as a party. To see that we were being covered live on, I think we were on BBC News, and I think we were live on Sky News as well. Good to see us being proactive, having something to say. And Daisy is one of my party's best communicators, and so it was good to see her answering questions on a range of topics, not just the policy issue that she was there to talk about. And I think we need to be doing more, and I think she'd done the morning media round as well that morning. So this is good. I think we need to be seeing more of this from my party because, I worry that, and even on this podcast, it's a bit like this, that, it's time for the comedy Lib Dem final bit, when actually, we are a serious party. We have 72
Really?
MPs now. I think, yes, Chris, we have 72 MPs now. We could well be part of whatever comes next in quite a major way. So, I mean, I've said before, people who write off the Lib Dems are very silly because we have an ability, a cockroach-like ability, Tim Farron has famously said, to keep going. And sometimes we're doing less well, sometimes we're doing better, but that's cracked George up, that is. But we carry on going. And funny enough, I think there's a possibility next May. I mean, who knows? But there's a possibility next May that we might end up part of a government in both Scotland and Wales. So I mean, never count my lot out. We're always there, always fighting for our people. And I was just really pleased to see Daisy Cooper getting out and about.
I mean, I'll say I very much agree with the policy, but my question is why stop at hospitality? But anyway, George, your reaction.
Well, I'll have to look more into the policy and whatever it is. Like, in my opinion, I think we need radical change to change society. We've seen, living standards collapse. We are seeing, the NHS on its knees. And sure, it might be a good policy for hospitality. I'll have to look more into it. But there was a thing you mentioned earlier, Mathew, which is very interesting, and I want to bring it back. You mentioned about the coalition government and the representation of the Liberal Democrats. I think it's really important that we do talk about not just the coalition government, but the early 2000s, because actually people starting university right now, particularly politics at university, were born in 2007, so they might not be able to remember Charles Kennedy or the coalition government, for example. Now, I took out an undergraduate loan, a master's loan, and a doctoral loan. I'm now £100,000 in student debt. So there are 100,000 reasons why I'm not going to be voting for the Liberal Democrats because, again, without Nick Clegg, that would not have been the case. But you say, the Liberal Democrats are a serious party. And, a party with 72 MPs that have a big bloc, and it's a solid bloc as well. I don't think that bloc is going to be going anywhere anytime soon. In the 2029, I doubt the numbers will be significantly different. And that does need to be treated seriously. But serious parties need serious accountability. The leader at the moment is Ed Davey, who voted 832 times with the Conservatives on the bedroom tax, for example, which is a heinous policy, on welfare cuts, and so much more. And, you know, I think he does need to be held to account for that for a lot more. Now, it's odd because, like, I would trust the Liberal Democrats more than the Labour Party right now. Just on trans rights alone, you know, the Liberal Democrats are at least unequivocally standing with trans people. And that is so important. We need political figureheads to do that. And good on Ed Davey, good on Zach Polanski and others, and long may that continue. And I think the social liberalism from the Liberal Democrats is something that, you know, I think is a good message to promote. When it comes to economics, though, you know, the fundamental economic orthodoxy that the Liberal Democrats are pursuing is the same economics that have put the country in its position right now. Yes, there'll be good policies that tinker around the edges that do help people. I'm sure there are, and including, like, you know, expanding childcare and free school meals, etc. during the coalition government. I think that was a good thing. But that came alongside £80 billion in cuts, which led to the deaths of over 300,000 people. So, you know, I think the Lib Dems, if they are going to be treated as a serious party, which I think they should be, they need to be held to account over their time in government, because I do believe that they would get into bed with the Conservatives again. I don't think they'd get into bed with Reform and would probably break more bread with Zach Polanski than Nigel Farage, for example. But the fundamental economic vision that's Ed Davey supported for 5 years when he walked through those voting lobbies to vote for the bedroom tax, to make life worse for the most vulnerable people in society, that needs to be remembered at the next election. And yes, that might have been 14 years ago, but it still matters because people are still feeling the impacts of austerity today, in my opinion. But, you know, it's a fair policy, and long may the Lib Dems continue to advocate progressive policy.
Well, quite right. So just a couple of points to end off on. Number one, you know, as an ordinary member and at conference, which, as you know, is our policy-making democratic way of doing things, I opposed much of what the coalition government did, and those were not easy years for people like me in the party, but I did as much as I could at the time to say that what we were signing up to in large respects was wrong. And also just to note alongside this that another thing has been announced this week, and that is the result of our party's presidential election, and the candidate that I supported, Josh Babarinde, our wonderful MP for Eastbourne, who is very much a rising star in the party, was elected party president with, I think, something like 80% of the votes. And I think he may, you know, when Ed Davey decides, and I don't think there's any great push for him to go at the moment, but I think when Ed Davey decides that his time is up, I think Josh Babarinde will absolutely be one of the people who looks to take over the leadership of the Lib Dems, and obviously he has the benefit of not having been an MP at all during those coalition years. So Josh Babarinde is a name to look out for the future of the Lib Dems and British politics, Chris.
Yeah, and we'll definitely cover him and any further developments on this podcast. Well, Mathew will definitely make sure of that. Put it that way. But it's interesting that the Lib Dems are, you know, are trying to get attention, and they're trying to get attention not by playing around in theme parks, but by actually announcing serious policy. Although it's quite a small policy, but it's, you know, I suppose it's progress. But anyway, that is it for this week. Thanks very much, George, for your time and contributions. Mathew, do you want to say your little bit at the end?
Yeah, well, first of all, can I say, George, you've been fantastic, and hope you've enjoyed it. And you know, we'll definitely look forward to having you on again, because I think it brings yet another new perspective to our podcast, which is what we really like. So thank you. And yeah, folks, please do all the internet-y things. Please like, please subscribe, please follow us on Twitter X at Frenemies. We are building our audience, as we always say. It takes time. We're a very crowded field of political podcasts, but we're getting there slowly but surely. So please tell everyone you know about us. And we'll look forward to seeing folks next week, Chris.
Yeah. Again, do join us next week. You know, again, great debates, great guests, and and I hope you have a good weekend. And join us again next week for another episode of Political Frenemies. Goodbye.